EoR takes a deep and profound look at the Great Visionaries, where they were right, where they recognized how consciousness relates to, indeed manifests reality, and where they were wrong. This second episode of Volume 4 clarifies the standpoint here, the angle from which I view these great teachers. The Essence of Reality explores how the psyche which you are creates the reality you encounter. Right here, right now, you found the Essence of Reality with unique insights into human consciousness, how life actually works. The reality you experience flows in a way that neither religion nor science can recognize. Here you see just how you attract and thus create the real qualities of your life. No God or any other source dictates your health, success, relationships, only you. To gain awareness of that inner-outer connection and move your life in positive directions, stay tuned and check out other episodes. We have topics aplenty to cover. Volume 4 pieces all address the depth of understanding put forth by the Great Visionaries. The first part glimpsed the featured teachers whose messages subsequent issues will explore, and it laid out just what constitutes a visionary in the first place. That is, someone able to see beyond the limitations of his predominant cultural worldview. The greatest could perceive, at least to some degree, the workings of life's complex, meaningful flow. And they sensed, to varying degrees, the interactive nature of consciousness and reality, as the inner manifests a flow of events and relationships in personal experience, then relates to it. But before launching into 10 parts that cover centuries of time and a broad diversity of ideas, we need, you and I, to establish a standpoint. That is, to clarify from what angle I view the teachings of these great masters. Most of your contemporaries, even some rather enlightened ones, some well-known speakers, view the words of Jesus, the Buddha, Mohammed, and others with sacred sterility. They handle the parables with white gloves. They regard the Four Noble Truths as unquestionable certainties, and/or the 5 pillars of Islam as sacred. That wide-eyed adherence to time-honored suppositions is because they haven't traveled far enough on their own personal journeys to see the shortcomings, that is, inaccuracies in the words of the old sages. I have, and I do. But the tough part is presenting that particular standpoint to you. Tom Nair here, as ever exploring consciousness. Perspectives here provide visual addition to my website, my books, and some 200 talks I've given to open-minded groups, sincerely seeking to understand life. Through a mystic experience and subsequent personal inner journey, I've come to see the oneness of things. We all encounter an inner-outer connection of self with real events and relationships of daily life. Becoming aware of that connection, you can improve real life by finding and changing inner roots to outer problems. And when you become aware of that connection, fully aware of how all aspects of your life emanate from your own deeper psyche, you can see in certain messages of old qualities of clarity or fallacy and distinguish one from the other. Let me rephrase that. When you yourself grow in awareness beyond the level of any particular teacher, ancient or modern, only then can you see within the content of that teacher's words both accurate observations and flawed ones. The tough part becomes presenting that stance with sincerity and accuracy while not sounding smug and self-aggrandizing. A simple declaration to the effect that one is well beyond the standpoint of Jesus or the Buddha in itself carries a major cultural caveat. People don't like to hear that, especially not followers of either icon. A know-it-all isn't well received. Smarty pants, a wise guy. self-centered and full of himself. Lots of demeaning phrases to heap on anybody who would deem himself wiser beyond the level of the ultra-wonderful Savior, the enlightened one, the final prophet, or other iconic teachers of the past. Most idolize the ancient visionaries to a degree. Part of that orientation has to do with a near worldwide practice of magnifying ancient sages. In Jesus' time, whatever he had to say would have been taken lightly by most of his contemporary listeners in comparison to the definitive declarations of the great prophets who long predated Jesus. When Gautama spoke to his peers a half millennium before Jesus, he had to compete with already ancient Hindu accounts in the Vedas. These, like words of the ancient Jewish prophets, were definitive truth in the time of that man, Gautama, who only later would himself be elevated to mythical heights by subsequent generations. So ancient teachers are commonly given sacred status, often enough well beyond their due. A crude myth over time has often bloated their status to superhuman levels. Of course, it's more than just passage of time. Any criticism of their long-cherished messages, particularly in the case of Jesus, the Buddha, Lao Tzu, and Muhammad, is a direct affront to the large contingent of mankind which generally greatly venerates, even worships, those old masters as super beings. Over half the population of the planet, nearly 4 billion people, idolize as basic supermen one of the visionaries I'm about to regard in Volume 4 pieces. The core of the problem is this. Most people don't consider the real live human who huddles behind layers of myth and exaggeration. Yeshua of Nazareth is a prime example. That peasant construction worker of Galilee we call Jesus, who came to see things quite clearly, would be astounded and appalled at the bogus Christ Superman generations of deluded believers have made him out to be. He despised organized religion, yet the fools and rubes of ages have turned him into the idol of yet another one. Buddhist monks likewise don't regard the actual person who was Siddhartha Gautama, who gave up his noble status to explore the world in his own mind beyond boundaries of his day. They revere a fantasy figure who grew over centuries, a ceramic figurine of peacefulness, not real inner peace. Muslims, too, don't objectively contemplate the real character and context, the good and bad sides of Muhammad, an actual man who spread his views forcefully. Most people regard only the mythical facade of a deity-connected hero, in effect, a make-believe superhero that accrued ever more embellished regard well after his lifetime. I appreciate these and other ancient visionaries for their message, particularly in the face of resistance during their lifetimes, and measured within the context of man's advancement. My point is never to criticize them or their views on life, but they were all humans, nothing more. Each had views that grew out of their base cultural understanding. Each formulated a worldview that saw beyond established confines of their time. But that worldview invariably incorporated two major limitations. First, while they saw beyond ideas of their time, they did not see all things clearly, not any of them. In each of the messages I'll regard here from the greatest of visionaries, there are noteworthy observations that aren't valid. So, did the original visionary have a limited view? Or was his message distorted by others long after he voiced it? Or both? Well, that doesn't much matter. If you confuse the myth and unfounded declaration as fact, you'll never see the limits to any message if you regard that messenger as irrefutable, and you won't outgrow that ancient visionary standpoint if you hoist it up onto a pedestal way above your own capacity. Second, they expressed their views in archaic languages. That in itself assured distortion in the message as it came down. The original languages weren't replete with adequate terms to properly illustrate psychological constructs of an advanced nature. With limited expression and restricted vocabulary of ancient tongues, a clear explanation is simply not possible. Add to those two factors yet another three enhanced distortions. The original expression of those teachers was not at all accurately recorded. Neither Jesus, Muhammad, nor Gautama wrote down their perspectives personally. Accounts come from others, often written much later, long after the death of the visionary, based on old memories. Jesus' words stem from accounts first recorded 4 to 7 decades after his death by Greek writers, when his words would have been originally spoken in Aramaic to illiterate peasants. The Buddha's original language was Magadhi Prakrit. Most likely, that isn't really known for sure, but teachings attributed to him date only from centuries after his time, written in other languages. Muhammad himself was illiterate. The Quran and Hadith were rendered to writing after his death, but based on other people's memories, impressions, and notes. So the third guarantee of distortion is the reliability of the visionary's message in its recording. And the fourth is inevitable alteration of content by translation. Languages are never completely alike in expression, and ancient tongues are particularly difficult to render into modern English, as their idioms and usage are often simply unknown. Thus, any translation doesn't carry the same meaning as the original. Indeed, it more likely principally carries the viewpoint of the translator, more so than that of the originator. And the fifth is that expressed ideas mean somewhat different things to different people. Stories about sheep and fish presented to peasants lose meaning in a society of handheld communication devices and rapid transportation. So take even a very insightful message spoken originally by a highly visionary person. Render those ideas to other, far less visionary people. Have the tales brew by retelling over years, decades, or even centuries. Render them to writing in perhaps another language. Translate that language once or twice over added centuries and style changes by people even more influenced by added myth and distortion. What do you have? Well, in the following volume 4 issues, I'll tell you exactly what you have. I've come to see the oneness of things, the functional inner-outer flow that constitutes life. I did that on my own, by observing and interacting with life events, by combing inner subconscious structures, not by latching on to academic accounts or assurances of gurus, preachers, rabbis, or imams. Given that personal perspective, I can and will in the coming episodes explain what the original visionary meant, and how that message captured life's real nature, or didn't. I'll do that frankly and with all due consideration for the integrity of the original visionary, but with little regard for the sanctity of bloated spirituality held by modern religions or movements. That means little or no political or spiritual correctness here. I'll lay the messages of the great visionaries out as they are, then evaluate them as accurate or flawed relative to how life actually works. And I'll do so from a standpoint somewhat to considerably beyond that of the visionary himself. Now, to be absolutely frank and straightforward, if my observation of my own level of perception sounds overly smug or self-aggrandizing to you, that's a problem you'll have to deal with. You can conclude that I'm just another know-it-all, bad-mouthing religion or criticizing wisdom of the past. Or you can follow through on my various pieces, gaining considerable perspective yourself, provided that you're open-minded enough to consider the many points I raise. Remember, these videos cost you nothing. I want nothing from you. Never seek followers. Never intend to establish a movement or promote a cause. Indeed, you can only gain from the exposure to fascinating ideas and the unique angle of consideration I offer here. As I have no vested interest in your action, it's of no consequence to me whether you proceed to view Volume 4 pieces or not. If you aren't open-minded enough to gain from my perspectives, I would just assume you don't proceed. You won't grasp the meaning. And if you compare my perspectives to your prefixed notions and solidified truths, you'll not like what you're about to hear. But if you're open-minded, sincerely want to understand life, and capable of questioning your own beliefs, you have a great deal to gain. Before launching into 10 parts that cover centuries of time and a broad diversity of ideas, we need, you and I, to establish a standpoint, that is, to clarify from what angle I view the teachings of these great masters. Most of your contemporaries haven't traveled far enough on their own personal journeys to see shortcomings, that is, inaccuracies in the words of those old sages. I have, and I do. But the tough part is presenting that particular standpoint to you. When you yourself grow in awareness beyond the level of any particular teacher, ancient or modern, only then can you see within the content of that teacher's words both accurate observations and flawed ones. Most idolize the ancient visionaries to a degree. Most people don't consider the real live human who huddles behind layers of myth and exaggeration. Most people regard only the mythical facade of a deity-connected hero. But they all were humans, nothing more. Each had views that grew out of their base cultural understanding. While they saw beyond ideas of their time, they did not see all things clearly, not any of them. Second, they expressed their views in archaic languages. So, the third guarantee of distortion is the reliability of the visionary's message in its recording. The fourth is inevitable alteration of content by translation. And the fifth is that expressed ideas mean somewhat different things to different people. I've come to see the oneness of things, the functional inner-outer flow that constitutes life. I did that on my own, by observing and interacting with life events, by combing inner subconscious structures. Given that personal perspective, I can and will, in the coming episodes, explain what the original visionary meant and how that message captured life's real nature, or didn't. If you are open-minded, sincerely want to understand life, and capable of questioning your own beliefs, you have a great deal, indeed, to gain.